1, 2, 3.
While our weekly shows are edited to time for broadcast, we offer to our members and podcast subscribers the full uncut conversation. The following is from our episode Trust Busting 2024, a bipartisan battle against monopoly power, where we look at the actions underway to tackle the problem of monopolies and the detrimental impact the concentration of power in this way can have on consumers, workers, and the democratic project. Laura's guests are two experts who have been involved for decades in antitrust action. Stacy Mitchell is the co-executive director of the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, and Matt Stoller is the research director for the American Economic Liberties Project. These audio exclusives are made possible thanks to our member supporters.
Here's a question for you. When you hear the news that two huge corporations are merging, becoming one, what's your first thought? Do you think, oh, good? Cheaper prices, better service, more jobs, fewer environmental harms? If you don't, you are evidence that a 40-year effort by neoliberals to convince the public that corporate consolidation is good for consumers has failed. President Biden agrees. Here's the president speaking in July of 2021.
We are now 40 years into the experiment of letting giant corporations accumulate more and more power. And what have we gotten from it? Less growth, weakened investment, fewer small businesses. Too many Americans who feel left behind. Too many people who are poorer than their parents. I believe the experiment failed. We have to get back to an economy that grows from the bottom up and the middle out.
Biden himself is no corporate dragon slayer, but the woman he appointed to head the Federal Trade Commission, or FTC, Lina Khan, comes pretty close. With a long history in antitrust law, she has brought more challenges than we have seen in decades, slowing many mergers and stopping a few. That doesn't mean that corporations don't keep consolidating their power in terrifying ways in healthcare, oil, telecommunications, media, and as one of our guests today has written, blood. But as our other guest has said, this is an extraordinary time in antitrust action. People power and government appear to have brought about a policy shift. Should we celebrate? Well, here to tell us more are two experts. Stacy Mitchell is co-executive director of the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. Her work, especially on Amazon, has been cited by Congress and the FTC. And Matt Stoller, author of the book Goliath, the 100-Year War Between Monopoly Power and Democracy. Stoller is a former policy advisor to the Senate Budget Committee. He now publishes the newsletter Big on Substack. Welcome both. So glad to have you with us. Stacy, let's start with you. Should we, who care about breaking up enormous monopolies, be celebrating?
I think we should feel very excited. I think that we have seen a real sea change shift in how people think about these issues and in what government is currently doing. And it's hard to say where the future is going, but I don't think we're going backwards. We have seen government dust off the FTC, the Department of Justice, dust off laws that have been lying dormant for most of our lifetimes, and really putting those laws to use and going after concentrated corporate power. And they are doing it in the context of building this growing political base. The reality is that most Americans, small business owners, farmers, ranchers, pharmacists, working people, consumers, everybody has a stake in dealing with a problem of concentrated power. And so the political momentum behind this and the politics behind it, I think, is distinct from a lot of other issues. And I think there's a lot of reason to feel that the path that we're on is going to continue, and is one of the most crucial things that's going on in policymaking right now.
Matt, how would you look at the same picture? I mean, the statistics are pretty clear that there's been more action, but there's also been a spike in merger efforts, filings.
Yeah, it's hard to look around the world and say, things are going great, right? It just feels like an overwhelming bummer, but that's really the residual consequences of 40 years of horrible policy. And so what we're seeing now, and it's not just Lina Khan, it's a whole bunch of other people, is what I would consider like a delayed policy reaction to the financial crisis of 2008, where people are saying, hey, maybe we shouldn't have let those banks get so big. And for about 10 years, bankers and kind of the old guard were thinking, you know what, yeah, that was a screw up, but maybe it's not that bad. Things kind of worked. But I think the younger generation of policymakers, it's been almost 15 years at this. It has been 15 years. Have said, no, actually too big to fail is a problem, and it's a problem everywhere. And you're starting to see significant change. But it has been 40, 45 years of policy pointed in one direction, and it takes a while to reorient it. But you can say, I'd give you sort of two facts why it's sort of an extraordinary time. And one is from 1998 to 2020, there wasn't a single monopolization charge from the Department of Justice. Not one. The Sherman Antitrust Act, the main part of it is monopolization, and they didn't use it once. Okay. Today, there are 5 antitrust cases at a different level, state and federal, against Google alone. Okay. So it is a really substantial shift. And the first one was actually brought by the Trump administration. Then there was some by the Biden administration in states. And so it's actually bipartisan. But you also see actions against Amazon, you're seeing investigations of United Health Group. It's just this massive sea change in enforcement priorities. The other factoid that I'd bring is that the Department of Justice Antitrust Division had never stopped an airline merger. Everybody knows the airlines are consolidated and bad, and they overcharge people, the ticky-tack fees, all the rest of it. Since the Biden administration started, there have been 2 successful merger challenges. And one of them was a kind of a quasi-merger challenge, was about a joint venture between the American Airlines and JetBlue. But the other one was Spirit Airlines and JetBlue, and that was a successful challenge. And one result is that airline prices today are actually lower than they were before the pandemic, because airlines actually have to compete. So there's sort of all of these changes that are happening. It's kind of the tectonic plates of politics. It's a little hard to articulate it and say, this is the reason that some of these things are getting better. And by and large, we're in an institutional framework where things feel like they're getting a lot worse. So it's hard to make the optimistic case. But if you look at the guts of policy, which is what Stacy and I pay attention to, it is actually an extraordinary time. And we will and are starting to feel these positive effects.
Great. Coming to you, Stacy. I mean, both of you have been there watching this happening on Capitol Hill. I know that you have worked closely with the caucus that exists in Congress now on this very question. How do you see the problem as you describe the problem today? We're seeing progress, but as you describe the problem today, what terms do you use? Because don't forget, we were sold this bill of goods around economies of scale and consumer benefits. What are you arguing is the problem with monopoly?
I mean, every sector of the economy just about is incredibly concentrated in the hands of a very small number of corporations. And for many years, the effects of this were felt by working people, by small businesses, by farmers. And the bill of goods that we were sold was that this was going to be good for consumers and that this was going to make the economy work better, allowing all of these corporations to merge and to grow ever larger and to take over one industry after the other. The idea was we were going to get more output and, more efficiency and these kinds of benefits. And oh, well, we lost we lost many generations of businesses. We have farmers that are screwed, communities that are screwed, but we're going to reap all of these rewards in other ways. And today, not only is it clear that we have just extreme inequality, that the cost that we have paid as people who produce value and work for a living has been extreme. But we also have an economy that just doesn't function very well in so many respects. I mean, you go around and there are all of these communities, urban and rural, that are missing basic services. They don't have grocery stores. They don't have pharmacies. They don't have banks. We have sectors where one disruption can shut down the supply of meat or baby formula. And we can just go on and on with the list of things of this is dysfunctional.
You wrote a chilling piece, Matt, about blood. I mean, talk about blood boil. I mean, my blood kind of froze over reading that. What can you give people a summary?
Yeah, but I just want to put a point on what Stacy just said. Basically, everything is Boeing, right?
Yeah.
The problem isn't that it's sad that
doors are flying off.
Just stuff doesn't work anymore.
Yeah.
Right? Wall Street's mad at Boeing. It's not even How do you screw your workers with a monopoly, offshore everything, and still lose money? Like, that's impressive.
Well, this is not making me feel safer about blood supplies, though.
Well, we look at the guts of policy. I'm not here to, I don't know, I got nothing. Sorry. So I wrote a piece called the Dirty Business of Clean Blood, which is about dialysis. Dialysis is what happens when your kidneys malfunction, kidneys clean your blood. And it is actually the only area of our economy, or the only area of healthcare, which is fully paid for by the government. So Medicare actually covers dialysis no matter what age you are. So it's Medicare for all, but only for, as John Oliver put it, one organ of the body, which is the kidneys. And it is controlled. This is an important problem because liberals like to think about we need single payer, that will solve everything. Well, we have single payer in dialysis. And it turns out when you have single payer and it's controlled, the provider side is controlled by monopolies, it looks a lot more like the defense base than it does, the Canadian healthcare system or whatever healthcare system you want to talk about as good. And in the case of dialysis, it's controlled by two chains, DaVita and Fresenius, that they have about 70 or 80% of the market, although the market is more, because it's local, it's basically a group of small monopolies. If you don't get dialysis and your kidneys are malfunctioning 3 times a week, sitting there for 4 hours a time, you die. It's very simple. And the clinics, it's these giant needles that go in your arm. It's just like a horrifying procedure. And these monopolists do all sorts of incredibly horrible things to people. If you complain about the clinic, there's credible reports that they will make it hurt more when they give you, there's all this crazy stuff that they do. But the, these are allegations. But what we do know is that mortality rates for dialysis in the US are much higher than they are in Western Europe and Japan. And we also know that when there's consolidation of these clinics, that hospitalization rates go up and deaths go up. I mean, it's very clear that not having competition in these markets kills. And so we see this over and over and over in lots of different areas. Yes, in a bunch of areas, it's just you get higher prices, but in areas like hospices and elder care and dialysis or other parts of healthcare, people die. And also in things like Boeing, people die. So it's the problem is really fundamental. It's really scary. It is the tectonic plates of politics, but fixing it isn't that hard conceptually. And once we start to focus on it, and that's what's exciting about this social movement that Stacy and I are kind of a part of, is you're oh, this is why everyone in America is mad.
Yeah, well, that's what I want to come to you about, Stacy. I mean, you and I have been talking about this for years, and I think it was clear to you well over a decade ago that monopolies were not helping your neighborhood or your healthcare or making you feel safer when you fly in planes. What shifted? Just a new generation of people came into office? The weather changed over Washington, D.C.? What happened?
Well, I think Matt is right about the financial crisis. The aftermath of that, not only what happened and the breakdown of the banking system, and it's, the cause of that being rooted in this incredible consolidation of power in Wall Street, but the policy response to it, doubling down on the idea of, well, we should just let the banks get even bigger. And meanwhile, ordinary people and local economies are going to pay the price. And that was the aftermath of the financial crisis. And I think when you look at the years that followed, 2014, 2015, and the anger over that across the country and the fallout in terms of just massive inequality, especially in the racial wealth gap that happened as a result of that. And you had, policymakers and economists and others who are looking at these big problems, one big question in those years was, why is it that we have this a growing income gap, wage gap, when we have low unemployment? And they couldn't come up with an answer to that. And the answer, as it turns out, is that when you consolidate industries, the corporations that dominate those industries have the ability to hold down wages because there's not enough competition for labor. Why is it that we had, this 25-year decline in the rate of new business formation? We're supposed to be this entrepreneurial country, and again, people grappled with that question. And as it turned out, as we did the research, the reason is consolidated power. So part of the answer is that there was a recognition that these deep-seated problems were coming from concentration and that was driving it. But the other thing that happened is that the conversation really changed. It used to be back in the days, like when Walmart was growing and we were sort of fighting about the proliferation of these big retail chains, we were doing this cost benefit conversation all the time that was ridiculous, where it was like, oh, well, they lower wages, but they lower prices, which is worse, and you just never get anywhere with that. And what changed is that the country started having a conversation about power, and saying the issue is not what marginal benefits this company might deliver or might not deliver. The question is, are we running our own lives? Are we running our own country? And there was a recognition that concentrated corporate power is a political problem because these companies effectively govern us and govern our communities. And that, once that conversation started, it resonated so much with people because it's people's lived experience in the reality of their daily lives. And that began to create this kind of bottom-up political movement. And, fortunately, I think to the surprise of many of us, including me, President Biden was a convert to that. He got that. And he put in place some very strong leaders who are aggressively using the tools that they have.
As you point out, Matt, Lina Khan isn't alone at the FTC. Tim Wu and others have been there at her back. But here she is speaking in the summer of 2023 at a House Judiciary Committee hearing, talking about how we got into this situation and how she hoped to get out. We'll have a little clip from her testifying, answering a question from Gerald Nadler. Coming back to you, Stacy, you're being humble in the sense that you were a big part, as was Matt, in bringing public pressure and public attention to these issues. You've been at it for a long time. One of the refreshing things in both your writings and Matt's, and increasingly in the language coming from the FTC, is that it's very plainly spoken, plainly said. And then I looked into the laws. Some of them 100, 110, 150 years old. They're pretty plain spoken too. And they talk actually less about competition and more about people. Talk a bit about how the language of some of these statutes is coming back into favor, and what's different about the song, if you will, being sung by this administration than those that preceded it.
I mean, what's extraordinary now is you have a lot of people going back and pulling up these laws and pulling up the legislative history. We all grew up in this time where, the line was that antitrust is about efficiency. That is the goal. We want to create more efficiency. And sometimes, allowing companies to merge makes them bigger and more efficient. And you go back and you look at these laws, and it's not about that at all. It's really about how do you structure an economy where you promote competition and the beneficial effects of that, and you disperse power in a way that enables people to actually govern democratically, and to exercise a degree of liberty as individuals and collectively in their communities. I mean, one of the extraordinary things that has gone on in the last year is that the current administration has adopted new merger guidelines. And I know that sounds like way in the technical weeds, but it represents enormous sea change in how the government approaches mergers. It's crucial. And part of how that change came about was going back and looking at the laws. For example, there's a 1950 Anti-Merger Act. And you go read the legislative history and the law itself, and it's very clear that the goal is to stop mergers that might lessen competition. I mean, it's a very low threshold for saying no. And the political conversation that led up to it is all about community self-determination and this notion that we must disperse power, economic power, if we want to live in a democracy.
Also, I'm seeing in some of the new merger guidelines more attention to the labor force. And Matt, I wondered if you wanted to speak to that part of this story.
Sure. And I want to just highlight one word that's coming back that's in the old statutes, which is unfairness, right? That is a big, you talk to these annoying nerds that run things and they're like, what is fairness? We can't calculate that. We should just ignore it. And I've been at these lawyers and economist confabs. They're the most irritating people in the world. We've had statutes and traditions around fairness since Babylonian times. And this is not impossible to understand. And it's in the law. And so, Chair Lina Khan, it's also in lots of agencies actually have unfairness authority, unfair and deceptive practices, things like that, unfair methods of competition. So it's a huge, this is just it's a moral argument, but the morality is actually baked into statute. One of the elements of it that you just, I think appropriately raised, is the question of work, right? Antitrust and labor, for a variety of historical reasons, have kind of been separated. You have labor law, and then you have antitrust law, which mostly people have thought of in product markets, like the stuff you buy and sell. But as it turns out, you can apply it to labor markets because companies buy and sell labor, and they just haven't. And what scholars have realized, and normal people realized before the scholars did, but labor markets are really concentrated. Like, it's pretty hard to get a job with someone else in the same industry when you have few options to do that. And so as it turns out, when you have a merger, you get to lower wages, right? And we've known this for a long time. In the 1980s, the whole thing about mergers is cool. We get to lay a bunch of people off. That is a merger. That is a lessening of competition in a line of business for work. But we didn't actually develop the economic and legal tools to address that until relatively recently. And now, for the first time, with a merger in the book publishing industry, and then a merger, which is Penguin, Random House, and Simon & Schuster, that was challenged by the antitrust division, and now a challenge of the mega merger between Kroger and Albertsons supermarket chains. You would now have the enforcers actually saying that consolidating power over workers is in itself a violation of the law.
Well, having heard reasons to be cheerful, Stacy, I'm coming to you. What are you most concerned about in this moment?
I think the power of the tech companies. I mean, we have, a handful of companies that control the flow of information, the flow of commerce. It's an extraordinary amount of power that they have. And we do have a number of government cases that have been brought to break up that power. And I have a lot of hope that we're going to win those cases and that there's going to be other actions that government can take to deal with that. But it is certainly extraordinarily scary when you have companies with this kind of, they have godlike powers of surveillance and manipulation and control, a level of monopolistic power that we really haven't seen before.
Does AI change the picture? I mean, I'm looking at OpenAI as buying this and buying that. That has me a little nervous.
Well, absolutely. And because of the resources, the computing resources that are required for AI, in the absence of intervention, then the power that comes from it is really, we've got, again, it's going to be Google, it's going to be Microsoft, it's going to be Amazon that are able to control AI because nobody else has the computing power and the money to actually to run those systems. And so the real risk here is that they will use control over this new technology to prevent new developments that would challenge their power and to use it in ways that only augment their power. And that's deeply concerning. And, especially at a time we certainly see the Biden administration trying to address this in a number of ways, but, having a Congress that's dysfunctional in that context is deeply concerning.
Coming to you, Matt, before we get to the politics of this, there are various tools that any administration has at its disposal. There's the FTC, which we've talked about. There's the Department of Justice, and you've referred to the Antitrust Division, which I always thought would be a good name for a band. When it comes to remedies, what are possible remedies? And maybe take for as an example the case the government currently has, one of several against Google. What could be done?
Yeah, so just to start with a basic framework, which is there's antitrust, which is a narrow legal tool to address market competition in certain markets, and it's run by a couple of different divisions of the government. States have some jurisdiction. But then there's the broader anti-monopoly frame, which is not just about the antitrust division, but has to do with tax policy and zoning policy and bankruptcy and healthcare plan, all sorts of things that you can do to structure markets, how the Defense Department buys, how HHS and Medicare reimburse, like all of these things structure markets. And so part of this, we're just kind of at the beginning where we're trying to embed the principles of open and fair competition back into these institutions. So I just want to make that clear. But in terms of Google and remedies, right, this is specifically an antitrust question, right? Because you have an antitrust trial where the government or a private plaintiff tries to prove that a company is an unlawful monopoly. And if they win that then it goes to what's called the remedy phase, where the judge says, okay, I buy the argument, or a jury says, I buy the argument this is an unlawful monopoly. Here's what you have to do to no longer be an unlawful monopoly. And that can be anything from break off these pieces of the company and sell them, like we did that with Standard Oil. We've done that with AT&T. You've done that with a whole bunch of other companies. It can be get rid of these patents, or let anybody license these patents, or get rid of these particular contracts, there's lots of stuff you can do. So it's just about saying, all right, what is causing the monopoly here? And then how do you restructure the business so that there is no more market power? There could also be financial damages and things like that. And so with Google, right, and one of the problems with talking about big tech, this is not just true for Google, it's true for all of them, is that these aren't one line of business. These are economy. They span multiple industries. They span key infrastructure across whole swaths of different business lines. And so when you're talking about Google, you're talking about YouTube, you're talking about Google Cloud, you're talking about search, you're talking about all sorts of advertising plumbing, you're talking about maps, you're talking about tons of different investments in automobiles, energy, like telecom. Like, this is a massive institution. And so what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to do it like you eat an elephant, which is one bite at a time. And there are 5 different antitrust cases. The first one, Google has already lost the first one, which is on their app store, so their control of phones. And that one, a judge, could and may break, just to say, all right, Google, you have to divest your phone division, your Android division. Or he might say, here are rules you have to follow around your app store, or any number of other things. There's going to be an argument about that. It's going to go on appeal. But that's also true for a Google search trial. It's also true for a Google advertising software trial. And if they're investigating Google Maps, so it could be something, all these different elements. You could have a trial and then a particular remedy on that particular area. And you could also have Congress or state legislators or foreign enforcers actually come in and say, we're not going to wait for a trial. We're just going to do a remedy. So there's lots of stuff that you could do, but basically split these companies up and make them serve all comers in a neutral way, kind of like a railroad. Those are the 2 options.
Well, what about other options? We've heard on this program around pharmaceuticals, Stacy, coming to you, the case made by patient advocates in response to the Biden plan to cap, or the Biden action to cap insulin prices. Why don't we just go public with some of these drug makers, as Gavin Newsom's done in California, creating a generic publicly owned company? Is public ownership an alternative kind of remedy after some of this breakup happens, or maybe as part of it?
I think public ownership, can be a solution, and I think certainly there we have seen insulin prices, come down. Some of the price gouging that was going on has eased up a bit, and partly in response to the news by California and elsewhere to go into manufacturing. I think there's some sectors where public ownership and public options makes a lot of sense and can create competition and alternatives, and can hold companies accountable by essentially making them to compete on the merits. And I think there are other sectors where if we can, break up monopolies, if we can put in place the right kinds of measures to keep them in check, we begin to open up a lot of space for people to create new enterprises, and for, the many existing businesses and workers and farmers to actually be able to succeed.
You said, I think it was you, Matt, that this isn't a right-left issue, that there is bipartisan interest on this question. Certainly in the last presidential race, we saw both President Biden and former President Trump talking sort of populist talk about breaking up big corporations. I'm not a partisan person in this. I've plenty of critiques of President Biden, but the records of these 2 administrations in power are quite different, aren't they? Could you lay out the distinctions for anybody who's hazy, Stacy? I mean, how would you compare the records of the last 2 presidents in office, the last 2 presidencies in office on this question? Because this anti-populist talk is likely to come from both parties this election.
Yeah. I mean, what you see with Republicans often, and Donald Trump certainly, is, selling a bill of goods in terms of, populist rhetoric that is not actually matched by policy follow through. And what we are seeing in this administration is we actually have people in place who are making huge change and are using the tools to the full extent that they have them. And this is just, to go back, having decades in which government deferred to big business, government of both parties deferred to big business, and did not aggressively address these questions. It's really been a huge shift. That said, the politics on this are, the country itself, there is a lot of grassroots support for the idea of dealing with corporate power. Everybody is feeling this, whether it's grocery prices, whether it's what's happening in rural America, where, in some respects, the concentration of power has been particularly acutely felt in rural America. That is driving both parties to at least have to respond to their voters rhetorically. But it's hard to, there's really no comparison in terms of actual results between the two administrations.
Your thoughts on that, Matt?
I think I'm probably more charitable to the right than Stacy, but I think a fair comparison would be, there was a bill that passed in 2022 called the Merger Filing Fee Modernization Act, which strengthened antitrust laws. And it wouldn't have passed with just the Democrats, just the Republicans. But about 80% of the Democrats in the House voted for it, 20% voted against it, and about 25% of the Republicans voted for it, and 75% voted against it. So that's a substantial number of Republicans, but it's still a majority against it. And that's kind of what you see. So Trump, he allowed Disney to buy Fox. So he allowed the consolidation of Hollywood. He allowed, private equity to do a bunch of different stuff. He allowed, a lot of consolidation, but he also did initiate antitrust suits against Google and Facebook, initiated the suit against AT&T Time Warner. With Operation Warp Speed, he handed out, I think, 9 different contracts to pharmaceutical companies, so they competed for that. So there are reasons to see, they're basically incoherent, right? And every presidency is a number of different factions. And there were some anti-monopoly factions in the Trump administration. The anti-monopoly factions in the Biden administration are much larger and much more powerful. But I do think that both parties have problems, because while there's a lot of bipartisan interest, and I would say normal people are, kind of 90% hate monopolies, there are bad factions on both sides, right? And I think on the Republican side, the politics are getting more favorable towards anti-monopolism, but the establishment is still dominated by evil bow tie wearing nerds. Whereas on the Democratic side, people are kind of like, yeah, I don't like monopolies. But what they really care about are social questions. And so they will kind of like push aside the monopoly piece and say, yeah, that doesn't really matter. Or they'll say kind of vapid things like, we need single payer, when it's like they're not paying attention to, say, the dialysis problem, or the fact that like 90% of people have insurance, and you actually have to look at the getting insurance, which is a financial intermediary product, is not the same thing as healthcare. So for Democrats, it's more a prioritization problem. And I worry there's some backsliding. Like, there's a Maryland candidate for Senate named David Trone, who literally owns a giant liquor monopoly, and he's the Democratic candidate for Senate, or is likely to be.
There are definitely no angels here.
No, but the point, I'm actually saying there are actual angels. There are great people that are doing wonderful things. But the point is it's complicated on both sides. In the Republican Party, the discussion is coded in very weird ways, but there is a lot of progress on the populist side, but it's like the bank lobbyists are still kind of in control. On the Democratic side, there's also weird coded language. But I think for me as an anti-monopolist, there isn't really a faction, I'm a Democrat, but there isn't really a political faction that I can be like, yes, that's the one I belong to. There are people I like here and there. But that's what makes this problem so interesting politically.
I don't know whether you want to add anything to that, Stacy, but I do want to ask you both the question that we ask all our guests at the end of these conversations, which is about the story that we think the future will tell of this moment. You've been working for years with your colleagues for local, sustainable economies, Stacy. Do you think we're at a turning point? What do you think is the story the future will tell of now? with respect to this?
Yeah, I mean, we are definitely at a fork in the road, and I, have a lot of hope. I feel like we are at least actually talking about the core issues in a way that I don't think was true a decade ago. So the conversation has moved into the right place, and we are seeing some movement there that I think is really important. I don't know whether we're going to outrun the forces that are against democracy, which of course is what this is really about. Are we going to be controlled by the few, or are we going to actually have a democracy? And that is ultimately the bottom of the monopoly question. We have been, as my organization has been working for, as you noted, many, many years around how do we build up the right kinds of local economic systems that nurture communities, that create prosperity, that create happiness at the local level, that create sustainability. And one of the reasons that we're working on this set of issues is that we realize that no matter how successful those local efforts are, they have a hard time proliferating and really multiplying because the larger policies that structure our economy, particularly antitrust, also our banking policies that control the flow of credit, really are standing against those local economies. And so, if we can change this bigger structure, I think a lot of things that you've highlighted on your program of great local solutions suddenly have the kind of oxygen to grow and multiply. And some of the biggest problems that we face, whether it's inequality or the climate crisis, suddenly start to become solvable because we've allowed people at the bottom up really to be successful because we've taken the sort of yoke of these dominant corporations out of the picture.
Thank you for that. Matt, what do you think is the story, the picture, the story the future will tell of what we're doing?
Yeah,
doing?
I mean, I read it similarly to Stacy. I think we are in a race between mass disillusionment, because it's not that people want monopolies, but they mostly the opposition to it on a kind of from a normal people is it's not possible to take them on. Like they've kind of lose their faith in the rule of law itself. And that's kind of why you see people embracing things like crypto or get rich quick scams. They're like, well, you know what? How's that different than the banking system? Right? None of them went to jail for cheating people, right? And so you see this mass pervasive cheating and monopolization everywhere. And it's pretty hard to believe in what we believe in, which is the rule of law. Concentrations of power are dangerous, and the rule of law should apply to everyone in a relatively equal fashion. So that's kind of the challenge, is how do you persuade the public to that what they want, which is anti-monopolism, the rule of law applying to everyone, is possible? How do you convince people that self-governance is possible? And I think that's where we are. We're in this weird moment when people want what self-governance can deliver, but they don't believe it is actually a thing that they can achieve through their political system. And they say things like, well, the government wants blah, blah, blah. And it's like, the government is us, right? Like, so it's just this very strange ahistorical moment. And there's always a fork in the road. I agree with Stacy. We're in a fork in the road, but there's always a fork in the road. The other part here is a lot of the laws, particularly the Sellar-Kefauver Act in 1950, it was passed in the specter of fascism, saying, we don't want to go like Germany. They had 2 world wars because everything got consolidated. We don't want to do that here. In a lot of ways, I think that's what we're wrestling with, is just kind of authoritarianism. And it's coming from the corporate sector. And that's what, it's really hard to make that argument, because people want to, Trump broke their brains and they want to hear, oh, Trump is the big problem and stuff like that. And that's really, he's a big problem, but the authoritarianism is actually coming more from Google than it is from a lot of the ways that people are being told it's coming from.
I don't want any kind. So can I just say next to both kinds? Okay, just checking. Stacy Mitchell, Matt Stoller, thank you so much for being with us. This is a great conversation.
Thanks for taking the time to listen to the full conversation from our episode Trust Busting 2024, a bipartisan battle against monopoly power. These audio exclusives are made possible thanks to our member supporters. Members receive early access to select uncut conversations, like Laura's interview with Angela Davis and our upcoming uncut from our episode featuring artist Ai Weiwei. Please consider donating during our May Day fund drive. Our goal is to raise $25,000, the cost of producing one episode for TV, radio, and as a podcast. And if you are a monthly supporter, please consider upping your monthly contribution by going to patreon.com/Laura Flanders and Friends. That's also where you'll find more information on this conversation in our episode notes post. That's patreon.com/Laura Flanders and Friends. And thanks again to all our member supporters. Please consider upping your monthly contribution or make a additional or one-time donation at lauraflanders.org/donate.